Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today for the second of two webinars on the Homegrown Innovation Challenge. My name is Jeff Cool. I'm the head of strategic initiatives here at the Weston Family Foundation, and I'm joined by a few of my colleagues whom I'll introduce in a moment. Um, as we did during the first webinar, I'd like to kick off just with a few housekeeping notes. And firstly, I'd just like to ask that you keep your cameras and microphones off. I suspect they will be muted in any event. I also just want to alert you to the fact that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our website in the coming days for anybody to review. We'll be using some slides today, and we'll also post those both in French and English on our website again in the coming days. Speaking of website, if you haven't checked it out already, please do so. A lot of great information there. The URL is www.homegrownchallenge.ca. My last point is that we are going to reserve a significant amount of time at the end of today's session to answer your questions. The way we'll do that is by just looking at the questions you submit in the chat box, and we'll try to get through each and every one of those before we leave the call. So at any time, if you have a question you want to pop into the chat box, please go ahead. We'll keep track of those, and as I said, address them toward the end of today's webinar. Thank you. Many of you submitted questions in advance of the webinar today. Thank you for doing that. Just wanted to note a few. Someone had submitted a question about berry propagation techniques, about wild bees for sustainable crop production, about pesticide discovery. Someone had a question about primary research trends and research needs to be addressed. I don't think we'll cover those today, except to say that any or all of these are acceptable solutions in as much as they go toward addressing our challenge statement, which we'll review in more detail today. We are not prescriptive about the approach to address the challenge statement. All we really care about is at the end of the day, hopefully many of you come up with solutions that do respond to that challenge statement. There were a few other questions that were asked. One was about major challenges to operators. Another one was how to sponsor a company for funding. And a third was the potential for sustainable agriculture research opportunities. Before we answer those questions, we'd ask whoever submitted them, if you're on the line today, if you could please just elaborate a little bit more so that we're better positioned to give you an answer. So if you recognize any of those questions as one that you submitted, please give us some more information in the chat box and we'll endeavor to address them. So with that, I'm going to move into the agenda for today's presentation. Before I get there, I think what I will say is the reason we do these webinars is not so much just to recapitulate the information that's on the website or that otherwise we've disseminated. It's really to try to give you a little bit of context, a little bit of nuance to better position you to prepare your application and ultimately participate in the Homegrown Innovation Challenge. On that topic, please note that if you don't know it already, the first deadline's coming up fast for our Spark Awards. That's May 3rd. And we'll cover this more later in the presentation, but suffice it to say, you don't need a lot as a qualified donee to apply to Spark. You don't need partnerships. You don't need a fully fleshed out budget, even a fully fleshed out idea. You really only need the seeds of an idea to be able to submit for that Spark Award. So we're happy to discuss this more, but please keep that May 3rd deadline in mind. And I think you'll find if you go onto the portal that it's not an overly onerous application to prepare and submit. So back to the agenda, you'll see we've separated this presentation really into 7 sections. We'll kick off with a little bit more about introductions, both in terms of our staff here at the Weston Family Foundation, as well as about some of the guest judges that we've just announced. We'll talk a little bit, very briefly, about the background and impetus for this challenge. We'll then go into the challenge structure and key dates, talk little bit about eligible applicants and crops, what type of berries we're looking for, what we're looking for in the selection of a berry. And then we'll wrap up at the end of the presentation by covering a few frequently asked questions and then getting into those questions that you're submitting in the chat box live. I think it was a great discussion we had back in March when we were at our first webinar, and we're hoping that it will be also a good discussion today. So just moving into introductions very briefly, as I said, my name is Jeff Kuhl. I'm the head of strategic initiatives here at the Weston Family Foundation. I've been involved with the design of the Homegrown Innovation Challenge really from the beginning. I'm very shortly, I'm going to hand off to my colleague, Dr. Lucas Alexandrovich, who's the program manager of the Homegrown Innovation Challenge. And helping us today is Emma Carey, who's a program coordinator dedicated to the Homegrown Innovation Challenge here at the Weston Family Foundation in Toronto. To be sure, our role is really around design and coordination. We have an external entity, an external panel that's really responsible for decision making and ultimately making funding recommendations. And we're pleased to announce that we've now appointed a judging panel of 7 international experts. And on the next slide, I'll just go through those names very quickly. I think in many ways, the Homegrown Innovation Challenge was designed to respond to some of the economic opportunities articulated in the Barton report that was released by the federal government in 2017 or thereabouts. And I'm pleased to report that the chair of our judging panel for the Homegrown Innovation Challenge is none other than Dominic Barton, who was also the chair of that commission that produced the report in 2017. So we're just delighted to have Mr. Barton on our judging panel as chair. Of course, most recently, he was the Canadian ambassador to China, and he's very excited about what we're doing, and we're just delighted to be engaged with him. The other judge we have representing Canada is Dr. Jennifer Grenz from the University of British Columbia. Then we have 2 judges from the United States, David Babson of the Advanced Research Agency, ARPA-E, in Washington, as well as Dr. Molly John from the University of Wisconsin. We have Dr. Akeem Doberman, former head of the Rothamsted Research Center in the UK, as a judge as well from Germany. We have Sarai Kemp, who is an early stage investor in agri-food from Israel. Sarai also helped us with some of the design elements of the Homegrown Innovation Challenge, so delighted that she agreed to stay on and help us as part of the judging panel. And our 7th judge is Dr. Hisham Fitnassi, who works in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates, quite an expert in controlled environments. So we think we've established a great and well-balanced judging panel. Again, these are the individuals who will ultimately make funding recommendations to the board of the Weston Family Foundation, who will make those decisions on where to direct the significant funding associated with the Homegrown Innovation Challenge. Also want to let you know that just for the Spark phase, we've invited a few additional judges to participate in the process. These judges will be from Canadian institutions. We've selected them, but we haven't finalized their positions as yet, so we're not in a position to announce them. But stay tuned. We should be releasing that information very soon. Okay, if we just move on to the next slide, I'd like to just jump into the background and impetus a little bit for this challenge, and then at that point we'll transition to Lucas, who will go a little bit into the challenge structure and review some of those key dates, including that fast approaching deadline for Spark applications, which is May 3rd. So if we go back really to the beginning of the pandemic, it was the Weston Family Foundation really made the decision to try to do something, I think, to really strengthen Canada and Canadians in the wake of the pandemic. The goal was very much an ambitious one, and that was really to promote resilience and to reduce vulnerability. So we really started a process to try to design an initiative that fit in that framework and and food was not top of mind for us at that point. But as we dug in, we quickly were alerted to some of the problems with supply chain and the risk associated with disruption of supply chain in regards to food, and really latched on to this risk associated with, closure of borders for prolonged periods of time, and our significant reliance on foreign entities, particularly around fresh fruits and vegetables. As we really dug deeper, we came to terms with the fact that we can produce a lot of great fruits and vegetables in this country out of season, but generally speaking, it's costly to do so. Um, so really taking account of those factors, those risks, um, we made the decision to design an initiative that ultimately, and at the highest level, increase production of fruits and vegetables year round uh, in Canada, and also reduce costs. Ultimately, what we wanted to achieve was just to make Canada more self-sufficient vis-a-vis the production of fresh fruits and vegetables. So early on, we had the idea, we knew what target, what problem we wanted to solve. What we didn't know was how that could be achieved. And that's why we ultimately decided to use the Innovation Challenge format, which is particularly relevant when you have a situation where you know what the goal you want to achieve is, but you think there are many different pathways that can get you to that goal. And this is a great um, format that will stimulate innovation in a number of different areas that can lead to addressing that challenge statement. We get a lot of questions about why we ultimately focused in on berries. And we write a little bit about this on our website, but what I will say in summary at this point is we were looking for a common focus so that it was easier for judges to apply different approaches, different applications. And we focused in on berries because we thought they're very popular for really all Canadians. There's a significant trade deficit. We import a lot, a very high percentage of what we consume in this country is imported from foreign countries. They're valuable. There is some significant margin when we're talking about berries. They're nutritious. And we also thought that berries really are in an innovation sweet spot. Uh, More efficient growing systems. Some work has been done on that, but not so much that the problem's already been solved. We wanted to avoid areas where we would really need to go back into the basic research in order to make progress on the development of a new production system. I think in some ways, most importantly, we thought that if a team could come up with a solution that addresses our challenge statement for berries or a berry, we thought that that system will be transferable to multiple other crops. And I think that's a really important point here. Um, that's what we're looking for ultimately, are systems that can immediately have an impact for multiple types of fruits and vegetables, not only berries. Um, and in that sense, this is all very much meant to be a pragmatic design. We really want, by the end of this challenge, we want solutions that can be put into the marketplace and start to address the trade deficit and making Canada more self-sufficient really from day one. The last point I'll make just before handing off to my colleague Lucas, uh, is that we also think there is a significant opportunity for Canada. We're well aware of the excellence in agriculture and include indeed in agricultural innovation in Canada. We're aware of the abundant natural resources, the significant amount of arable land, permissive policy environment. So we had a number of consultations with experts around the world, and there seemed to be consensus that this is a great place to try to lead the charge in developing more productive growing systems for fruits and vegetables. And we think that it's a great place to do it. And not only can we address our own needs in this country, but we also think we can position innovators and farmers and producers and researchers to really lead the charge around the world and provide those technology solutions to those outside Canada. So I'll stop there If you have any questions about anything I've presented, or if you have any questions at all about the Homegrown Innovation Challenge, once again, please pop those into the chat box. We'll start to collate those and come back to them at the end of the call. So with that, I'll hand off to my colleague, Dr. Lucas Alexandrovich, who will drill down a little bit on the specifics of the challenge.
Great. Hello, everyone. I'm Lucas, and I'll just go over more details around the structure of the challenge, funding, and eligibility of ideas that we're looking for. So to begin, I think it's important to start at the overall challenge statement, which is the goal that really we're working towards and that we're supporting IDEA towards. And that reads as to create and deliver a market-ready system to reliably, sustainably, and competitively produce berries out of season and at scale in Canada. So at its core, we're really looking for growing systems to grow berries out of season in Canada. But there's a couple of things I wanted to highlight about the statement. The first is that there's quite a bit of nuance in there as well, and there's quite a few terms in there that we've chosen specifically to define to help define what else we're looking for. One of those is the market readiness of the solution. So at the end of the challenge, we're really looking to commercialize the solution that comes through the whole process, and ideally let it have real world impact in the final stages of the challenge. Another important aspect of the challenge is reliability. So the solutions that we fund need to be tested and trusted so that businesses and growers can invest in them. Of course, we're also looking for sustainability, so thinking about reducing environmental impacts, which is also a very important priority of this. We want the solution to be competitive, so that it needs to be adopted at scale, and be competitively priced for end users and growers to take it up. Of course, out of season as well, that's really the crux of the challenge, looking to improve food security and extend the seasonality of the food we grow in Canada, and of course at scale. So I'll explain a bit more, but towards the end of the challenge, we'll be providing funding to make sure that it can be scaled up and be used across Canada and not just kind of sit in a lab or in a small test bed. The second point I want to make about this is what Jeff mentioned too, but it's the sort of the beauty and the simplicity of a challenge prize, which is, we have a defined goal, but there's many different ways that we can get there. So the solution space is quite open. It can really consist of anything that you feel would help us get to that challenge statement goal, whether it be around new energy sources, controlled environments, climate control, disease management, robotics, or breeding and genetics of berry varieties. Anything's in scope as long as it aligns with that challenge statement goal. Next slide, please, Emma. And so in terms of the phases of the challenge, so we're going to be running this over 6 years. In total, we're going to be distributing over $33 million. And that funding is going to be awarded over 4 funding rounds. And those funding rounds are structured to help provide support across the kind of whole innovation pipeline. So really from early ideation to proof of concept, and in the latter stages to scaling up. In the first 3 funding rounds, the Spark Awards, the Shepherd phase, and the scaling phase provide grants. So that's money that the teams can use to hire staff, build out and test their idea. In the fourth, the final funding round, is an award, which is given as a retrospective prize to 2 teams. So I'll talk a little bit about each of these. So the Spark Awards are the first ones. Those are due soon in 3 weeks, and those provide $50,000 to teams to really flesh out the idea. Teams at this stage, we just have an early vision, some basic details and elements around that vision, but that money indeed is used to, for example, bring on partners and collaborators and to fill in any kind of data or technological details you would need, and really to help prepare for the full application that's required in the Shepherd phase, which is a bit more detailed. It requires a business plan and technological innovation plan. So that early seed funding for the Spark Award is really to help teams get prepared for Shepherd phase. And we'll be giving out 15 of those. The Shepherd phase applications, which are due in December, those awards would provide $1 million to 10 teams. And at that point, that's the funding that teams can start use to build out and test their growing system idea. So at this scale, we'd be looking for a proof of concept, for example, on a small plot of land, in a small greenhouse, or in a lab, just to see that it's feasible and that it works. And teams would have a year and a half to use that funding and develop that idea. From those teams, we would consider 4 to then be scaled up in the scaling phase, where they'd receive $5 million. At this point, we'd be looking to scale up that growing system to a farm level to show that it works on a bigger scale, but also importantly to then start to test whether those innovations, those ideas can also translate to other crops. And for the scaling phase, we'd be considering 4 teams to receive that funding. Teams would then have 3 years to implement the scaling phase aspects. And then at the very end of the challenge prize in 2028, we'd be looking to give away two awards of $1 million each. One would go to a team that kind of comprehensively addresses all those aspects of the challenge statement that I talked about, so sustainability, scale, out of season production, reliability. And another of the $1 million prizes would go to the team that simply showcases the highest and most novel technological leap in their growing system. And the important thing to note about these two is that the first 2 funding rounds, the Spark Awards and the Shepherd Phase, are independent. So you don't need to have applied for the Spark Awards or have received one to apply for Shepherd Phase. If a team misses the deadline for the Spark Awards, that's fine too. They could just wait for the Shepherd Phase and apply at that point. But after the Shepherd Phase, the process is locked in. So then only the teams that had received a Shepherd Award then get considered for the subsequent scaling phase awards and for the final prize awards. Next slide, please, Emma. So given the structure, I'll talk a little bit more about who is eligible to apply. So one of the major eligibility considerations for the Homegrown Innovation Challenge is that we're looking for qualified donees to lead teams. That's an aspect of the Weston Family Foundation being a charity and our obligations under the Canada Revenue Agency prescriptions, which means that we can only directly fund other qualified donees. Now, there's a number of different categories and types of qualified donees. The CRA website does a good job of listing these, and I think on the slide you can see the 10 different categories. Within these, the most relevant ones, I think, for this challenge would be the registered charities, which is a big umbrella, and that also includes colleges and universities, as well as Canadian municipalities, as well as municipal or public bodies performing a function of the Government of Canada. So there's a wide variety of qualified donees that can apply. But having said that, we do also encourage multi-stakeholder teams to apply. So we know that innovation and high quality creative ideas would best be served by having a lot of different stakeholders on a team, contributing their expertise, their knowledge, as well as technology. So to that end, for-profits, startups, growers, other entities can join a team. They just cannot be the lead applicant on an application. So in terms of the makeup of a team, so going into this a little bit more, because on the application form we would be asking about the status of each of these members. A team would be made up of a principal applicant. So that's really the person leading the proposal. They'd be responsible for overseeing the direction and execution of the project. And the principal applicant has to be a qualified donee at an institution that's based in Canada. A co-applicant can also join a team. They would also be involved in kind of overseeing and running and designing the project. They would also need to be from from an organization that is a qualified donee, but not necessarily based in Canada. Because some of the qualified donee categories, there aren't many, are international. So for example, UN organizations or international universities that have representation of Canadian students at them. So there are some categories that would apply there. And lastly, a collaborator can then be basically the industry partners, growers, others that are not qualified donees. So they can substantially contribute to the project, but not necessarily lead the work. And of course, they would not necessarily need to be a qualified donee either. So we know it's not always easy to build a team, to find those team members, to find the skills that you need. So to that effect, we are going to be trying to support and work with you over this next year to help you find some of those team members that you would need to complete a team. Indeed, that's what the Spark phase funding is for, is to help you find other team members. But we also have other channels in place as well. And for example, we just launched Circle, which is an online networking platform last week, where people can log on, sort of describe either what they can offer, what services or experience they can offer, and vice versa. People leading teams can articulate what they're looking for, what skills and gaps they still have, and hopefully that can help others find each other and help those teams build themselves. But if you do have any challenges in this regard or any questions, please do get in touch with us and we're happy to help. So then in terms of eligibility, Jeff mentioned why we're focusing on berries. And in terms of berries, there's a large number of berry examples that are eligible. So you see in the list, in the box on the left-hand side, this is not an exhaustive list, but it includes all the popular varieties you'd see in a supermarket, but also other kind of more local native varieties that are native to Canada. And again, there's other examples that would not be on here. And if you have any questions about another berry variety that you are considering that's not on this list, please do get in touch. But we do have some inclusion and exclusion criteria that would guide the selection of the berry and berry eligibility. So basically, we're looking for berries that would be grown in a growing system that's transferable to other fruits and vegetables. And we'd also be looking for berry varieties that are culturally and or culinarily important to Canada. And what we would be excluding is fruit from annual plants or fruit from trees, any fruit that's not primarily intended as a food, so used as an input into other kind of industrial or agricultural processes, and any fruit or berries that have an atypical growing approach. And I think the prime example for that last category is cranberries. But otherwise, a wide selection of berries that are eligible. If you do have any questions about any specific varieties you're thinking about, again, please do get in touch. And then in terms of judging criteria and how we will be assessing and thinking and looking at the applications, we've outlined a number of judging criteria that are going to be guiding our assessment over the 6 years and over the 4 different funding rounds. And I'll list those here, but they're available for you to look at, and I think importantly to consider as you are writing out your application, kind of thinking about which aspects to emphasize. But briefly, we'll be thinking about impact. So can the solution deliver on that challenge goal and that impact statement we have outlined? We're going to be thinking about the technological achievement. So how innovative and novel is the technology that's being proposed? We'll be looking at the team capability. So is a team in place and are they able to deliver on that growing system idea? We'll be looking at the commercial viability. So thinking about, can the solution thrive in the market in terms of both consumers and end users of the technology? So those people that would be purchasing or using that system in the end. We'll be thinking about environmental sustainability. So what are the footprints of your growing system and how do they compare to the current growing standard? And ideally getting those footprints down. And in the first Spark funding round, we'll also be looking at just the need for the Spark Award. So how would you use those 5 months and that $50,000? How would it help you get ready for the Shepherd phase? And what would you be doing with that funding and time as a consideration of need? And you'll see also that the weighting of these categories shifts slightly over time. So for example, over the funding rounds, we'd be focusing a bit less on team capability, because hopefully that core team is already there and in place. And towards the end of the challenge, focusing more and more on commercial viability as we're thinking about finally kind of scaling up and commercializing and getting the growing system used at scale in the country. So with that, I think we can move on to the question and answer session. At this point, I would encourage you to list any questions you have in our chat box, and we will be taking those and answering them in turn over the remainder of the session. I think to kick off, we have a number of frequently asked questions that we wanted to get into. These are questions we asked a lot about. I think it'd be worthwhile just to go over these and clarify some of these aspects. So the first is, how is Loblaws involved in this initiative? The answer is that it's fully separate. The operating businesses from which the foundation gets its operating budget are completely separate. And of course, for the Homegrown Innovation Challenge, we very much have a kind of publicly and social good in mind. And that challenge statement really defines what we're hoping to achieve from the goal, which is about improving and increasing the well-being and resilience of Canadians. So must an entity be a qualified donee to submit an application? The answer is yes. I think this also applies to any organizations that are waiting, that have applied to be, for example, a registered charity. They're still waiting on an outcome from that process. So unfortunately, you would need to be a qualified donee at the time that you are submitting an application to us. Will Weston Family Foundation staff review any written proposals before the deadline? We cannot offer any detailed feedback on a written proposal, but we're very happy to have a call, have a chat, and answer any high-level questions about the scope, the eligibility, the berry varieties, and the like. How important is it that an innovation team has prior experience with berries? So it's not important at all. And it may well be that a team that's never worked in berries before the Homegrown Innovation Challenge, wins the final prize. Again, we're really looking for transferable technologies, and indeed the funding over the challenge period is really used to help transfer an existing idea or technology you have to berries. So it's not necessary that you would have had previous experience growing berries, but it might be beneficial. Is there any technology that is not relevant or eligible for the challenge? The answer is really, a lot of things are in scope. As we mentioned, we dictate the outcome, the goal that we're heading towards, the vision we want to see, and it's up to the community to propose how we get there. So as I mentioned, a lot of different ideas are eligible, anything from disease management, robotics, controlled environments, energy sources, aspects of agronomy and open field farming. If you can justify how it gets us to extend the berry growing season in Canada, then it would be in scope. Another question is, can I develop a production system for a non-berry crop that is relevant to berries? So again, in this challenge, we are focusing on berries. However, if you do have an existing system, an idea that you're using for another crop that potentially could be relevant to berries, then please apply with that idea. And as I said, the funding for these stages can be used to test that growing system and see how relevant it is to berries and see if it can be used to extend the growing season. Another question we've had is, what if a team fully addresses the challenge statement before the end of the competition? And that's fine. I think, as I mentioned, we have this challenge statement about an overall public good mission. I think it's fine if a team kind of spins out early and does address that challenge statement. And I think that also relates to ideas and teams that are maybe further along in their innovation pipeline and their innovation journey, and whether they can still apply. And the answer is yes. Yeah. Another question is, can non-Canadians participate in the challenge? So yes, so as I described in the different the different team members that can be involved within a team. So the principal applicant would need to be from a Canadian entity, from a qualified donee entity. Co-applicants do not necessarily need to be Canadian, and collaborators as well do not necessarily need to be from Canadian entities. Also, in terms of actually conducting the work, so in the shepherd phase, it is permissible that the trials, the growing of or the testing of the system is done outside of Canada. But given that we want this to be relevant to Canada, at the least, the scaling phase does need to take place in Canada. So before scaling, if you can justify why it would be beneficial for it to happen outside of the country, that would be fine. But in the scaling phase, the work would have to be done in the country, in Canada. And lastly, as a qualified donee, what do I need to have in place to submit a Spark application? So as Jeff mentioned at the very beginning, not much. You need a vision, some basic details of the elements of that growing system, and kind of a roadmap for how you would get there and how you would implement it and build it. But indeed, that Spark funding round is really to help flesh out how you would do it, the feasibility, how you would go about it. So I guess we raise this because we don't want to sort of block anyone that thinks that they're not far enough along in their innovation journey to apply. The Spark funding round is really there to help you kind of flesh out and solidify and cement your idea and the details and the kind of technical aspects of it.
Great. Thanks very much, Lucas. So at this point, we're going to move into the live Q&A session. And I see that there already are a number of questions that have been entered into the chat box, and we'll start to go through those. But if you do have questions and you haven't popped those into that chat dialogue as yet, please go ahead and do that, and we'll just go over them as we see them. So I'll dive right into it, and I think this is a great question to follow the last frequently asked question that you addressed, Lucas. Where can a prospective applicant get more detail on what's required for the Spark application, and where can they access that grant portal on our website?
Yes, absolutely. So the application is submitted through an online system we have called Smart Simple. So that's the link for that system is available on the homepage of the Homegrown Innovation Challenge. And really there you can log on. We'd ask you to create an account, and then the application form would be available to you. I think barring that, if you would like to see kind of a paper version of that ahead of time, you can email us and we can share that. But I think we would kind of prioritize and have a preference for you to log in and really kind of look at how the online system looks, what's required, just to get a sense of how much time you would need and to poke around and get familiar with the system, the electronic system, rather than a kind of a paper template.
Great, thank you, Lucas. We've had a few questions that relate to the use of proceeds for a Spark grant. And I won't go into the particulars, but do you want to address, Lucas, how a team that receives a Spark grant can use that funding, and what restrictions we may have in place?
Mm-hmm. So in terms of the eligible spend and the types of activities that are permissible, it's relatively open. We don't have any hard restrictions on that. In terms of overheads, we allow 10% of the total budget proposal to be spent on indirect costs on overheads. But the types of activities would again be thinking about how does that Spark phase enable you to put in a high quality shepherd phase application? How would it get you to the point of thinking about the different TRL, the technology readiness levels that we require, the different phases, and how would it let you kind of refine and define your growing system? to the point where you have the details you require to apply at the shepherd phase.
Yeah, and I think that's that approach, we're using that across the competition. Really, what we care about is that you address the challenge statement. We're less concerned about the approach or the means that you employ to achieve that challenge statement. So, as I said at the outset, this is meant to be very pragmatic in its design and indeed its outcome. So, relatively few restrictions uh, across the board. And of course, this is significantly different than our typical grant programs here at the Weston Family Foundation. We also had a question, Lucas, about how the fund is or can be distributed to collaborators. Do you want to talk about that briefly?
Yeah, of course. So our funding can only go directly to qualified donees. And it's up to the qualified donee to kind of determine how they need to spend and distribute that funding.
Thank you. We talk a lot about qualified donees, and certainly that is the one requirement for any team applying to the challenge. A question we've had, Lucas, is whether a team that is only qualified donees, maybe that doesn't involve producers or farmers or industry, whether that is eligible, that kind of team is eligible, and indeed whether it's sufficient to compete. Do you want to address that question?
Yep. It's definitely, in terms of hard restrictions, definitely eligible. We would say that, it would probably be unlikely that simply a single stakeholder, a single individual, a single organization would be competitive in the challenge. We envision that a competitive team would have a number of different stakeholders. So a college, a university, potentially grower, industry, uh, potentially startups, to have the sort of well-rounded experience, the equipment, and the experience to basically design and implement a competitive idea. So whether while it's not a hard requirement, we do see that we envision that the multi-stakeholder teams would be competitive in the challenge.
And maybe what I'll add to that is that, again, what we're seeking is that by the end of this challenge, we want market ready innovations that can be implemented and start to move the trade deficit, excuse me, the needle, as it were, around that trade deficit right away, and making Canadians more self-sufficient. So, I think that, I think it would be very useful indeed to have folks that are in experience with that scaling of innovation, with the marketing of innovation involved with the team. Again, not a requirement per se, but I think the judges would look more favorably on a team that had all the necessary components to take this really very much from the conceptualization stage to something that's market ready. So I think that's an important concept to keep in mind. I'd like to talk about team building real quick. Lucas, on several occasions, we've talked about how important it is to build a team and have that team approach to addressing the challenge statement. One of the questions related to how can teams access our application, which we've recently launched. I'll let you talk about that. But maybe you could just elaborate a little bit more on the role we can play at the Weston Family Foundation, indeed the role we want to play in helping to put teams together, helping to qualify donees, to identify co-applicants and collaborators, and vice versa, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jeff. So there's a number of channels we want to use. And again, I do want to emphasize that that's a big role for us over this year, as we know it's hard for, to sometimes work outside of your silo, to kind of meet others in other sectors or sort of areas of the industry. So there's a number of channels that we've been thinking about. The first is what I've mentioned about launching an online platform, which I think would be one of the easiest ways because it's automated. It allows you to log on, interact sort of independently with others, post what you're looking for and kind of see who else is in the community and able to offer services or their partnership on a team. And that I think that link is on our website. And after the webinar, we can also follow up with all the participants and share that around. But that platform is called Circle. It's really just a community platform. You'd be asked to create an account, and then you can log on and have access to our community. And within that, there's different spaces where you can look for team members or talk a little bit about what you're doing. And it's also a place for us to share updates about the challenge. So we're hoping it's going to be a lively and useful space, and would really encourage you to check it out. Otherwise, indeed, the Spark funding phase is really for qualified donee or teams led by qualified donees to apply, and from there, basically think about how can they augment and supplement and expand their team. So it'll be an opportunity for those awardees to bring on other members, as well as other applicants that had applied and not received a Spark award. I think there's going to be another opportunity to apply in the Shepherd phase, and we can help with matchmaking at that time. We're thinking about running some kind of in-person workshops and networking meetings for different teams and collaborators to find themselves. And otherwise, there's a bit of a manual process too. As we are running and implementing this challenge, we're landscaping and understanding who are the different players and actors in this field. And if you do have any specific gaps or any sort of challenges, you can get in touch with us, and we can maybe point you to, say, another team that has some expertise in energy, or a company that has some expertise in robotics that could fill a gap that you have. So again, primarily that Circle platform is kind of there for you to log on and really kind of poke around and find others independently. But otherwise, we can also support a bit more directly if you do get in touch.
Absolutely. We certainly encourage you to do so now or after you receive Spark funding. Or again, bear in mind, you don't need Spark funding to apply for the Shepherd phase. So even if you're unsuccessful in your bid to receive Spark funding, we still be delighted to hear from you and try to make the necessary connections to position you to put in a strong application to the Shepherd phase. The other point I wanted to make, just kind of in regards to this matchmaking function, is part of the role of the judges is also to interact applicants, grantees, prospective applicants. So look at the the judge list. We've also posted the bios on our website. If you have any interest in reaching out to any of those judges, a lot of them are in different countries, as you can see, and say, hey, who's working, who's got some, alternative energy systems that might be relevant to the solution we're seeking to investigate. We're happy to make that connection, and you can have a conversation there. And maybe they would be a good portal to access folks in other countries outside Canada, or even other Canadian entities to partner with you. So we're very very eager to be engaged and useful. I think at this point, one of our number one objectives is to ensure that we can get as many high quality applications into the Spark phase, and then later in December into the Shepherd phase as possible. So we're very much here to help. Also, just in regards to accessing that Circle platform that facilitates networking, thank you to Peter for posting the link in the chat box. You can go there, and I'll just read it out. It's homegrownchallenge.circle.so. So check that out. You've got to register and go in. We just launched this, so we're certainly eager to see it get used. And if you have any technical challenges, don't hesitate to drop us a line. We'll try to help you out. We're getting a few more questions around use of proceeds, restrictions on expenses, and I think I'll just repeat, what Lucas said earlier. We have very few restrictions on how funding can be used by a qualified donee. Really, what you need to do is demonstrate and convince our judges that it will be useful, important to position you to address the challenge statement, that all important challenge statement, which defines success in this competition. So if you can make the argument that defraying the cost of defraying part of a PI's salary to enable them to put more time into this, that will get you that much closer to being able to address the challenge statement, then so be it. We just don't have those restrictions in this particular competition. The one restriction we do have, which I'm not sure if Lucas mentioned this before, was around overhead. We do allow up to 10% of the grant proceeds to be directed to institutional overhead, not more than 10%. And to be sure, that's not above and beyond the grant amount that's posted. So for the Spark Award, it's $50,000 maximum, and that would include institutional overhead to the extent that you wanted to earmark some of that for that purpose. Okay. Had a question from Rebecca Lucas about whether there can be more than one co-applicant, and maybe I would extend that to say, can there be more than one collaborator as part of an innovation team?
Yeah, absolutely. So there can only be one principal investigator on a proposal. But there could be any number of co-applicants and any number of collaborators on a given proposal. In addition to that, a principal investigator can only submit one proposal, but they can join any other number of proposals as a collaborator or as a co-applicant. So it's relatively flexible in that way.
And indeed, what I would add as well is that any institution can submit as many applications as they please, and certainly we would encourage institutions to do so. So the only restriction is really around the individual, the lead innovator, that principal investigator who really has to focus on a single application, a single project. The other thing I just note about principal investigators, we do require that not only do they have that affiliation with an eligible qualified donee, excuse me, but that they spend at least 50% of their time in Canada for this during the course of their participation in the Homegrown Innovation Challenge. Just going down the list, we just had a question about intellectual property rights and who would be the owner of technology once developed. I can address that one very quickly, and the answer is that we take no interest in intellectual property. Just like we don't take shares. There are really no strings attached from the perspective of the Weston Family Foundation. So intellectual property ownership, intellectual property rights are determined pursuant to your institutional policy or otherwise pursuant to Canadian law around inventorship. The one point I will make, though, is that we do require that in the case of the granting of commercial rights, that any commercial entity that's developing the technology for market needs to make sure that Canada and Canadians are prioritized. So we do reserve the right to put certain provisions in the grant agreement that ensure that benefits to Canadians are achieved promptly. You can find more information about that and many other topics on the terms and conditions of our website at homegrownchallenge.ca. Okay. Another good question came in from Adam Lucas. What precisely do we mean by out of season? And are we talking about year-round production per se?
Yeah, so one of the criteria we'll be assessing is the extent to which the season is extended for berries. So the idea doesn't necessarily need to enable year-round production, but we would be prioritizing ideas and proposals that extend the growing season as much as possible.
Absolutely, and we elaborate a little bit about that on our website as well, about what we mean by extending the growing season. I think another point I just make in regards to your question, Adam, is that this is by no means restricted to those employing controlled environments to produce crops. We very much welcome applications from those using more traditional open field approaches, and that's why we do not have year-round growing as a requirement per se. So, for all the farmers out there, this is for you as well. It's not just for, producers and innovators. We want farmers involved in this, who bring all that deep expertise and deep experience from over the years. We want farmers involved as well, and very much open to that open field approach. Had a question about the Shepherd application. When will we be opening up the online portal to be able to submit applications for that phase in December? That's the deadline being December 20th, Lucas.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, thanks. I'll start that again. So we're hoping to have the Shepherd form live online after our Spark Awards are decided and awarded, so in late June or July. If you have applied for Spark, or if you had a look at that application form, the Shepherd phase form is going to be very similar. It's going to be all the same questions. Essentially, it'll just ask for a bit more detail and granularity on a couple of those aspects, on kind of the technological components of your growing system and the business plan around it. But it'll be quite similar, just to give you an idea of it. Yeah.
Someone joined the meeting late, Lucas, and wanted us to address frequently asked question number 6 about, whether we could focus in on a non-berry crop with the idea that eventually whatever system that results from that initiative would be relevant for berries. Maybe can you just, I think I don't mind revisiting this because it is an important concept. And, again, uh, people look at our website, they say, look, we see these berries, we recognize it. Are these the only berries that are relevant? I think that would be worthwhile to address. And then just the whole concept, this kind of means to an end concept. I think it'd be worth going over that again.
Yeah, absolutely. So the challenge does focus on berries as a test case. In terms of berry eligibility, we do have a number of examples on our website, and for any berry varieties that are not in that list, because it's not exhaustive, we do have some guiding criteria to consider about inclusion and different exclusion criteria for the berry variety. So the challenge strictly asks for a growing system for berries, but as we said, that is a means to an end. And towards the end of the challenge, we're then going to be looking at, and in fact, prioritizing growing systems that can also be translated and transferred to other crops to help spark and kick off some of that innovation around the whole food system and fruit and vegetables in general. So in the initial stages, yes, you need to apply with a growing system for berries. But having said that, you don't necessarily need to have worked on berries in the past, or if you're working on other fruits and vegetables now, and that system is translatable to berries, we would still encourage you to apply, because those funding rounds are really to test the feasibility of that system, whether it's been applied to another crop or whether it's still rattling around in your head and needs to be developed. That's what that essentially R&D funding is for. So if you are working on other crops and you do have an idea that could be applied to berries as part of that system, we would encourage you to apply and think about how to translate it to berries.
Great, thank you, Lucas. There's another question that came in just now that talked about new varieties, and this reminds me of a question we had in the last webinar about a new variety of strawberries. And I think the answer to the question is relatively straightforward and really relates to, well, is it transferable to other crops or is it not? And that the emphasis is really on the system here, not on the berry. But I'll let you elaborate on that a little bit.
I'm trying to read that and understand what's being asked. I guess I'll probably just start and reiterate again sort of the emphasis of what we're looking for. So it's a growing system for berries. One of the criteria we'll be thinking about is the extent to which that's also applicable and can spark innovation in other crops. That will be I think, more heavily kind of emphasized towards the later funding rounds. But in the first instance, we are asking applicants to just focus on a growing system for berries. Uh, would you add anything to that, Jeff?
Yeah, I think really what I would add is, we're not particular. If your selected crop meets the inclusion criteria but isn't excluded by virtue of the exclusion criteria, and you could demonstrate that coming up with a new production system that addresses the berry, that crop will be relevant to many other fruits and vegetables, then we're all for it. Uh, Again, that is our goal. As I said before, the emphasis here is on the system, not so much on the berry or really any crop. And again, what we're looking for is something that is applicable to many different fruits and vegetables, and ultimately will be able to make a significant impact on our productivity as a country, and ideally reduce the imports coming from other countries to satisfy consumer need. Um, Another question, and we've talked about this a few times, and I think is a good one. What if we go back to frequently asked question 7? There's certainly different entities or different stages of development. You're going to have one team that has never really contemplated berries. Maybe they've never even contemplated horticultural innovation. And then you're going to have another team that's quite advanced in the area and has already been thinking about this and how they can make a more efficient system and add the sustainability. Um, how do we treat those two? And ultimately, are we prepared to shut down the challenge early if we have a team that achieves that challenge statement before the end of that 6-year term, Lucas?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think starting with that high level vision of, extending the growing season, and even sort of above that, in terms of increasing the resilience, the food security, the well-being of Canadians. At the end of the challenge, I think ideally what we'd want is an ecosystem of different solutions, of different ideas. And in fact, that's why we're also funding a number of different ideas to go forward. So if one of the teams does end early, addresses the challenge statement, commercializes their product, we would not be looking to close the competition. I think we would benefit from, all the other funded ideas to keep moving forward, but also benefit from that variety of different approaches and growing systems. Because there would be differences in terms of different berry varieties that the different ideas are focusing on, different regions, perhaps different communities that they're applicable to. So I think there's probably not going to be one silver bullet that solves it for the country. And we are looking for a portfolio of innovations. So one entity kind of wrapping up early, that's great. That's great for our overall goal, but we would continue with overseeing and funding and supporting the other ideas as well.
I think a related question, and we got this as one of the questions that was submitted in advance of the webinar. Like, what ultimately is going to win this thing? Like, what are we really looking for? And maybe I could address that really quickly. And that is to say, just to remind you that we're looking for market ready solutions. We're looking for things that are disruptive, ultimately solutions that fully address and adhere to our challenge statement that can be implemented really from day one and start to have an impact on the market. We can't really go beyond that because we don't know what we're looking for, and that's the whole point of the innovation challenge format. We know what we're trying to achieve. We don't know what the innovation, what the solution is going to look like. So we're really very much leaving it to community. And indeed, we do fully expect that there will be multiple solutions that address the challenge statement and ultimately improve the resilience of Canada in this space. But we're really looking to you, the community, to come up with those innovative ideas, those out-of-box ideas that can indeed be scaled to the point where we can achieve measurable impact in the market. We're getting some questions here, Lucas, about the Spark application. One question from Johnny relates to, is this really, if an applicant, a qualified donee, completes the online application form, is that really all they do? And maybe I can ask you just to expand on that a little bit and talk a little bit about the process, just at a high level, that we'll be undertaking once May 3rd comes and goes, and indeed when we will be in a position to announce the results of the Spark phase?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the Spark application is done online through our Smart Simple system. Having said that, we're also accepting applications in French. And for those, we have a slightly different way of collecting those. And that's outlined on our French website. But essentially, there's a downloadable form, a PDF that you can fill out and email back to our team. But for both the English online application, the French offline application, the form and the requirements within it are all you need to complete a proposal. There's questions in there that are that you need to fill out. Some are mandatory, or most are mandatory, and it also asks for some additional information as well, including some information about your organization, CVs of team members and the like. So it'll instruct you to submit a few more files and documents, but all of that is laid out within the application forms. So as long as you follow those instructions, that's all you need to submit a proposal. Going back to the higher level view of what happens after May 3rd, after you submit your Spark application. So essentially, there's a number of steps. What we first do as the foundation team, we're going to screen those, make sure they're eligible and within scope. So making sure that that principal investigator is a qualified donee, that they can accept funding from the Weston Foundation. Just making sure that the growing system, the idea that's being proposed, is within the spirit and the boundaries of the challenge statement. And once an application passes that stage, then our judging panel comes in and begins reviewing. So there's a number of steps there. We'll ask judges to kind of read those and score them offline, and that they will be using those criteria and those judging weights, those assessment weights that are posted on our website. So that's how they will develop and score a proposal using those criteria that we've already outlined. And then again, we'll come together to kind of reassess all those applications, calibrate, make sure we're viewing them in the same way, and then make a final decision on the final 15 Spark Awards. And we anticipate that we'll make a decision by the end of June. And so all those that will get an award and those that won't will know by the end of June.
Excellent, Gus. And just to reiterate once again, you don't need a whole lot to put together a Spark application. So, take a look, go onto the portal, take a look at what's required. But it's really meant to, support the development of that Shepherd application, which is due December 20th. And bear in mind that, once you need to get in by December 20th into the challenge to be able to compete in the scaling phase and beyond. So again, if your application's declined in the Spark phase, that's okay. You can still come in the Shepherd phase. But if either you don't apply for Shepherd funding or if your application is declined, there's no longer an opportunity into the challenge, innovation challenge, after that point. Just coming back to another point, Lucas, we do ask for some biographical information for the principal investigator and collaborators, et cetera. So does that mean that we're putting a lot of emphasis on the experience of applicants in berries or in horticulture? How maybe you can just elaborate a little bit on how we look at the team and the people per se.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned, one of the criteria we're going to be looking at is the capability of the team. And that's really in relation to the growing idea that's being proposed. If that idea is something to do with open field farming, whether it's something to do with a heavily controlled environment or something to do with new energy sources, we're going to be looking at whether the right team members are in place to deliver on that specific idea and the components of the technology in that idea. So as we mentioned, doesn't necessarily need to be, people that have worked with berries in the past or berry growers specifically. It's really looking about that translatable technology and whether the right team is in place to design and implement and test it.
Thanks, Lucas. I'm just going to pause here to say, firstly, thank you so much for the questions that have been submitted so far. These have really been excellent. And just again, this is your opportunity to get your questions in. So please, if you have a question in the back of your mind, now is the time to put that into the chat box as we get to the bottom of the list of the questions that have been submitted so far. So please go ahead and shoot those to us, and we'll make sure we get to all of them before we terminate the call today. I also wanted to note that, you know, if you have questions or you require a more substantive discussion with the team after the call today, after the webinar, you're free to reach out to us at challenge@westonfoundation.ca, and we can set up a little bit of time to answer any of your specific questions or kind of to share some ideas, et cetera, or indeed what we're really eager to do is to help you find collaborators and others with whom you can work together on an innovation team. So please don't hesitate to reach out. That's what we're here. We're very much here to help you and to make sure we get the best possible applications into our Spark phase and beyond. Okay, so I'll go to another question here that's popped up. Lucas, does production end at the farm gate, or are we really talking about vertical integration all the way to the consumer? I think it's really the former, isn't it? But I'll leave that to you.
Yeah, that's a great question. So technically, in this challenge and what we're looking for, as it's a growing system, we are ending at the farm gate. We're looking for a system to produce, to grow berries outside of the typical growing season. Having said that, if you are working or developing an idea that's somewhere else in the food value chain, and it could be applied to extending the growing season, whether it's something to do about kind of novel packaging, new materials and the like, that can somehow propel and support that challenge statement of extending the growing season, then by all means, you know, do think about joining a team or applying as well if you're a qualified donee. Yeah.
What about solutions, initiatives that don't fully fit into the scope of the Homegrown Innovation Challenge, Lucas? Is the Weston Family Foundation willing to entertain partnerships or to support infrastructure outside of the context of the Homegrown Innovation Challenge that may have some relevance to establishing better production systems?
So at the moment, no. Our funding is reserved for the sort of open funding streams we have. I mean, having said that, a related funding program also launched yesterday around soil health. So if anyone's also interested in that space, it'll be worth looking that one up. But generally, no, funding applications and proposals and ideas have to fit within the scope of this Homegrown Innovation Challenge.
Thank you. What about do we require matching funding? And what is our thinking on the use of proceeds from third parties to support the development of the solution? And indeed, you might talk a little bit about, you know, really our lack of a relationship with the provincial or federal government.
Yeah, absolutely. So no, we don't require matched funding from industry, from government. This is an independent program. Um, Having said that, if your idea, if your growing system, you know, requires additional budget to be implemented, and if you do bring leveraged or matched funding from elsewhere, that's fine, and it could be beneficial. But we don't strictly require it ourselves. Yeah.
Question from John. At the end of the Shepherd phase, who would have ownership of the test plot? Could it be donated to a research station, for example? Lucas.
That's a great question. So as the Weston Family Foundation, we sort of take no position or stake in the technology or the land or the resources you acquire over the challenge. So that's a very interesting question, but that would really be up to the applicant team to decide what they do with it. Sounds like a valuable goal to donate it to a research station, but it's really up to the team themselves to figure that out.
Just as maybe Lucas contemplates the next question, I wanted to maybe talk a little bit. I come back to the whole concept that the Weston Family Foundation is not seeking to have strings attached here. We're not seeking ownership of any real property or any intellectual property. Again, the only exception, certainly not to ownership, but where we do seek to have some influence, is to make sure that Canada and Canadians benefit promptly from any innovation that is developed through this Homegrown Innovation Challenge. We do we do go into quite significant detail in the terms and conditions section on our website. So please check that out, and we update that from time to time. Of course, that's just really to give you a heads up. When we ultimately grant you funding, there will be a fairly detailed grant agreement, where we'll have binding provisions around some of these areas, and that'll to some extent be based on the terms and conditions that are listed on the website. There's also a section on eligibility criteria on the website. So if you haven't checked that out, please do that. And there's also the judging criteria. We do go into significant detail, which we don't always do as an organization with our funding programs, but we do go into significant detail on what we're looking for and how we will be appraising applications that are submitted. Indeed, even how the various criteria are weighted, and that actually shifts from phase to phase. So again, if you haven't checked it out, please do so, and I think you'll find it very useful. Okay, well, let me go to that next question, Lucas. How important is it to include the financial documents that we request? And maybe in addition to that, might even say, you can maybe speak a little bit to who needs to submit that kind of information, and maybe how we'll use those documents when we receive them.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I know which ones you're referring to. So, I mean, for us, it's a balance between sort of the ease of applying and not putting too much of a burden on applicants, but also having to meet our, kind of our legal obligations to understand who's applying and kind of due diligence to who we are funding. Um, so I think the way the system is set up now, so the principal investigator leads the application form. They have an account in Smart Simple, they log in, and they submit the proposal, and they need to put together all the required information from across the team members. I think what you're referring to is the due diligence documents we require from any organizations that are not qualified donees. So if it's a qualified donee, such as a college or a city or a registered charity, we're not asking for those financial documents. However, if you're not a qualified donee, we are asking for some of those. And I see what you're saying about whether, because the lead applicant, the principal investigator is leading that application, if there's an issue with them having a view of those documents to collate them and submit them. I think if there's any issues around that, I think, we want to be practical. So do get in touch. We can discuss it. And it could just be that the partners themselves, send them through to us separate from that main application form, and then we link them up afterwards. I think that'd be fine. But yeah, we're here to kind of, enable you and make the process as painless as can be. And of course, we don't want to kind of create any issues around confidentiality. So we're happy to work with you on that. Just, yeah, please get in touch if there's any specific issues around that.
Yeah, and maybe what I would add to that is, we will keep anything submitted to the Weston Family Foundation confidential, and we'll only share it with third parties who have confidentiality undertakings with the foundation, and obviously who have a need to know that information. But as Lucas said, we're happy to have a conversation if there's a particular issue. Generally speaking, just coming to the bottom of your question, Rebecca, we do expect applications to be complete and to not be missing any elements. And I think as a general rule, if certain information is left out of an application, there is a risk that it won't even be sent to the judges, that it'll be excluded from review really at the our scoping phase, as we call it. But anyway, happy to have a longer conversation about that as necessary. The other thing I'll add is, we're talking about a lot of money. We're talking about for if you are an applicant that enters the Spark phase, you successfully navigate the challenge, you win all the awards at the end, you're going to be receiving almost $8 million. This is a lot of money. It's a very high profile initiative, so we really want to be sure that we are being cognizant of who's involved and trying to avoid any undue risk in the challenge. Another question we get, and I know we keep on hammering this point of a qualified donees. Why are we restricting funding to qualified donees? Why can't we simply just open it up to anybody, individuals, for-profit entities? Why can't we just give our grants to any of those individuals? And the answer is because the Canada Revenue Agency precludes that. We are a private foundation, and so we are unable by law to make donations to entities that are not qualified donees. So that's why we have that requirement. But again, we certainly do encourage the formation of multidisciplinary teams. And indeed, we recognize that a lot of the experience around scaling innovations and implementing in the marketplace, a lot of the experience will often come from commercial entities. And so we also encourage the participation of commercial entities in these teams, including farmers. Okay. So I think we've gotten to the end of our the questions and questions in the chat box. I will just address one point about next steps, and maybe as I do that, if anybody else has any lingering questions, again, now is your opportunity to pop those into the dialogue. We did have a question. Will the presentation be shared after the fact? And the answer is absolutely yes. We did post the presentation from the first webinar, which is very similar to this one, on our website. We posted it both on the English website and on the French website in the respective languages. And indeed, even this webinar is being recorded and will be available to all of you if you want to go back and review what was said. So please check our website in the coming days and look for that. This will be the final webinar prior to the May 3rd Spark deadline. I think it's quite likely we'll conduct additional webinars in the summer and fall in the run up to the Shepherd phase deadline, which is December 20th, once again. Again, whether you're successful in the Spark phase or whether you're not, that Shepherd deadline's coming up, and anybody's welcome to apply to that. Had a question just as we could wrap up. Lucas had another question. Is a university a qualified donee? That's a question we get a lot. Do you want to just address that and maybe a little bit about how someone can identify whether they're a qualified donee or not?
Yeah, so just focusing on that question directly. So generally, universities and colleges are one of the categories of qualified donees. Usually they sit under the registered charity category. But having said that, it's, I think, up to you to confirm that. I'm going to post a link in the chat, and there's a very useful site that the CRA hosts. And under each of those 10 different qualified donee categories, you could either search for a specific organization or scroll alphabetically through organizations just to confirm that they're on the list. So it's up to you to confirm that your university is on there. But generally speaking, the vast majority of colleges and universities are qualified donees.
Yeah. Again, I think the key entities that would not be qualified donees typically would be individuals, for-profit entities. When we're talking about not-for-profit entities in Canada, they may or may not be registered charities. So you need to check that out. And there are some other, as you can see, there are others on the list, like municipalities, that are also considered as qualified donees. So I think this allows for significant flexibility. And again, I can reinforces the idea that we very much want these multidisciplinary um, teams that represent various interests and various stakeholders. Um,
And just to add to that too, we do get a lot of questions about examples of qualified donees. So I mentioned one of the major categories is colleges and universities too, but there's also about 60 or so horticultural societies across Canada that are on that list as qualified donees. First Nations communities, if anyone is from one of those, many of them are classified as qualified donees, would be eligible to apply. So I'd recommend poking around through that list, looking around. If you are looking for partners, I think you might be surprised by how many different organizations, groups are on there.
Thanks, Lucas. I had another question about qualified donees and in the context of a broader team from Rachel. Is there a requirement for a certain percentage of funds to be spent at the qualified donees organization? And again, I think the only way we would answer that is really to say that our requirement is that we can only support qualified donees, and those qualified donees are prohibited from making what we call uncompensated transfers to non-qualified donees. I don't think we go beyond that in terms of how we prescribe the use of proceeds, and certainly we expect. I think it's fair to say that qualified donees play a very meaningful and substantive role in the project that we would fund. Um, something you said, Lucas, reminded me of a question we've often received as well, and that is, when people are thinking about the crop or the berry they want to pick, should they be really focusing on those berries that we all know that have mass market appeal? And indeed, is the commercial potential of a berry important when it comes to their eligibility and their attractiveness for funding under the Homegrown Innovation Challenge?
Yeah, so under our examples of eligible berries, you'll see that there's a number of different varieties. There's the kind of popular varieties we all would know from supermarket, as well as other more local and native varieties to different parts of Canada. In terms of consumer appeal, strictly we're not strictly looking for just working on berries that are already widely consumed. A couple of the indicators and criteria that we look at um, do ask you to kind of describe to what extent you've done some market research about your berry variety. If it's not one of the popular ones, how acceptable would it be to consumers? How feasible would it be for growers to undertake and to grow? So as long as you can justify those things, then I think any of those eligible berries, could make it through the competition. Um, and I think it would be nice just overall too to have a diversity of berries being supported, just in terms of nutritional diversity, as well to kind of represent some of the more native varieties from across Canada as well. So yeah.
Once again, as I said earlier, another key point, an important thing to remember is it's really more about the system than it is about the berry. We want these systems that are applicable to a broad array of fruits and vegetables. Peter submitted another question. Thank you, Peter. Can a for-profit join multiple applicant teams? I think the answer is yes, and indeed, we'd very much encourage that. I think the one thing to be sure, though, is I don't think that the judges, would support the idea that a single company supports multiple applications that are all trying to achieve the same thing. So we'd like to see some differentiation among those applications. But absolutely, any institution can be involved in as many applications as they like, or as makes sense. And once again, just bear in mind that the only limitation is really around that principal investigator from the qualified donee organization. They can only lead a single application, even if the institution can submit multiple applications, and even if that individual can also be a collaborator or co-applicant on other applications. Again, I think we would want to see some differentiation, but there's no hard and fast rule about that. Maybe what I'll just ask as well that kind of picks up on something, a theme that we've been discussing today is, are there organizations, and I'm thinking mainly of not so much of the qualified donees. Well, maybe we start there. I mean, are there qualified donees that are ineligible, for example, by virtue of having previously received funding from the Weston Family Foundation, as an example?
No, so previous funding would not make you ineligible. I think if you're currently receiving funding, we'd ask that you flag that in the application, just so we can understand if there's any conflict of interest implications there, but otherwise, no, that would not disqualify anyone. In terms of ineligible qualified donees, I think that really just gets into the nuances of the difference between the roles on an application. So the principal applicant, the co-applicant, and the collaborator. The principal applicant needs to be a qualified donee from an organization that's based in Canada. A co-applicant needs to be a qualified donee, though their organization does not necessarily need to be based in Canada. And there's only a couple examples of that occurrence, and that's really UN organizations and I think universities and colleges based in another country who have Canadian students attend them. So that would be the only example of a qualified donee. It's not based in Canada, but they could join a team. They just wouldn't be able to be the principal investigator on a team.
We also make some reference to exclusivity arrangements on our website, and we want to know if there are exclusivity arrangements that may restrict the distribution of the food product. And we're not talking so much about the innovation. We're talking about the ultimate food product, the berry, the crop. At the end of the day, we want to know about those exclusivity arrangements. We're trying to avoid them, but we haven't expressly prohibited them. So just make sure you declare that, like you would declare any conflict of interest in the application, and we'll make sure we notify the judges and take that into account. Another question about whether these slides will be shared. Again, yes, they will. And look for them on our website, as well as a recording of this webinar. We'd actually, one point I'll just make about, we are conducting this challenge in both French and English. And we're certainly hoping to see a lot of applications from Quebec, which of course is a thriving agricultural industry. So we really hope to see a lot of applications. Moving forward, we were looking into the possibility of doing this webinar, at least having kind of simulcast it in French. That's not a function available using this platform, and we're using Microsoft Teams, although it is possible using other platforms. I think moving forward, as we get into those after the Spark phase, we start looking in the run up to the Shepherd deadline. I think we will look at doing that simultaneous translation so we can make sure that all of this information is available in English and in French live. In any event, just like we did in the first webinar, we are going to post the presentation. We're going to translate it and post it in French on the French language website. So if you're more comfortable reviewing the information in French, please look at on the French website. Another question I think that relates to some of the, it wasn't specifically asked, Lucas, but I think it makes me think of it based on some of the questions we've received today around teams. Is there going to be an opportunity for teams to network a little bit? I think, we've in designing this challenge, a lot of people have told us there are a lot of silos to break down. It's very important to try to foster this collaboration among innovators. Do we envision that this is something we can do, is really bring all of the the grantees together to meet and maybe trade ideas? And is this something, and I think that is something we're doing, just not necessarily immediately, but I'll let you elaborate on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that points to two different goals. One is to help teams build and expand their partners to really kind of fill any gaps that they have, to apply for the Shepherd phase and onwards too. I think another component is, as Jeff mentioned, just general knowledge sharing, kind of disseminating some ideas, sparking some, different ways of doing things for other teams as well. And absolutely, that's going to be a big part of how we support teams and the kind of events we hope to run over the course of the challenge. So I think in the initial phases, it might focus a bit more on team building, but alongside and parallel to that, and I think in the later stages, we'll also have opportunities to share knowledge, and just to disseminate some ideas between teams as well. Of course, teams are competing, so we're going to be mindful of kind of that aspect too. But I think there's lots to be shared and lots to be learned across teams as well.
We had an excellent question from Johnny earlier in the presentation about, it really, if anybody wants to submit an application to SparkPhase, do they need to do anything more than just submit the application through the online portal? You addressed that, Lucas, but we may have a requirement for some in-person interviews or meetings, but that's in the future, isn't it? We're not planning on doing any of that in the SparkPhase.
Yeah, that's right, Jeff. For Spark, it's just the application itself. For the later funding rounds, we might include an in-person interview that's still being developed. And when we finalize that process, we will post it on our website well ahead of the due date, so everyone's aware of what's going to be expected of them.
That's great. So I think we're really moving to we're getting toward the end of the webinar. We just have a few minutes left. So again, one last call for any remaining questions in the chat box. But I've got one more that came in from John, and we'll address that. But again, if you have questions, now is the time to pop them in. I think we'll end and aim to wrap up in the next 5 to 10 minutes. The question from John is, what if the Weston Family Foundation received 2 applications that are close to being the same, but are from different parts of Canada? How do we consider that, Lucas?
Yeah, absolutely. So bearing that they're from 2 separate applicant teams, that's fine. And I think we would just, assess them on their own terms and their own merits. And, we'd see which one sort of excels in the process. If this refers to, the same, well, an individual principal applicant can only submit one application. So that might already answer it as well. But otherwise, if it's 2 different teams applying with very similar ideas, I think that's fine, and they would just be assessed on the specifications within those proposals. Yeah. And again, I think it'd be useful too to have diversity across Canada, and that's what we're hoping to see from the applications coming in. But yeah, that would be fine to see different similar growing systems from different parts of Canada coming in. Yeah.
Great. Another great question from Johnny. Thank you, Johnny. Lucas, what about working on 2 berries at the same time? We've seen this question before. We've actually this is something we've received from on a few different occasions. We actually updated our frequently asked questions on the website to address this very point, but I think it's worth addressing here as well.
Yeah, so the answer to that is, I think no. We would need you to define the growing system and kind of choose one berry, partly because the criteria ask us to kind of look into the feasibility of that berry, consumer acceptance, and as well there might be differences in the production system. Having said that, if the production system can produce 2 different berries at the same time, if the same growing system, it doesn't need to be differentiated anyway, I think that would be in scope and applicable.
Hopefully that answers your question, Johnny. Okay, so I think we've really come to the end of the session. We, again, thank you all so much for joining us today. As I said, we will be posting this presentation on the website. Again, the English language webpage is homegrownchallenge.ca, and the French website is défi cultiver l'innovation.ca. So you can check out either of those websites to find a copy of the slides we presented today. As I noted, we will also be posting this recording on the English language website if you want to go back and listen to any parts of this. Um, and we will we'll go from there. As I said, I don't expect that we'll have another webinar before the Spark deadline, and that's coming up quickly, March 3rd. So get those applications in. Um, but we likely will have at least one other webinar in the fall, excuse me, in the summer or the fall to discuss the Shepherd application. Again, we expect to open those applications up sometime probably in the summer, and the deadline, of course, is on December 20th, and that'll require a little bit more information. And of course, those Shepherd applications, those Shepherd grants, are for a total of $1 million, and you need to have a Shepherd grant to advance in the competition toward the scaling phase, which is maximum $5 million, and ultimately to get some of those awards at the end of the competition. So with that, I'm going to wrap up. And again, if you did submit some questions that maybe we missed or weren't able to get to, please feel free to reach out to us at challenge@westonfoundation.ca. We'd be happy to answer those with you kind of one-on-one, or even have a conversation by phone. Also, check out that Circle application. I think it's a great platform to network and try to team build. And if that doesn't meet your needs, once again, we're happy to be involved kind of on a more manual basis. So once again, I'd like to thank Lucas Alexandrovich for really leading the way today. Emma Carey here is working with us in our studio, so to speak, on the webinar. Thank you all. Thank you both so much. And thank you for attending today, for your excellent questions. And we look forward to seeing your applications on May 3rd. So keep that date in mind. So that's it from us. And thanks again. Bye-bye.